Thanks so much for that introduction. I have to confess I changed my talk a little bit to reflect the marvelous Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit that's presently being featured in Milwaukee. So I want to talk about how to read the Bible from the standpoint of what we can learn from these Dead Sea Scrolls. So let me mention a few. I suppose some of you already read the exhibit and know this stuff, but I wanted to just tell you very, very briefly something about the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. These scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s at a place that's called in Arabic Qumran, and it's a site that's on the shores of the Dead Sea south of Jericho. And you can go there and visit nowadays. There are all sorts of tourist trips to see the site. It actually consists of a bunch of caves that are in these kind of high rocky cliffs. And then down below, archaeologists have dug out the foundations of what seems to have been some kind of settlement. And in those caves, scholars eventually, at first a bunch of Bedouin, found some ancient manuscripts, a library of ancient texts that had luckily been preserved there. As I mentioned elsewhere, I used to think the reason why they survived in this area, it's kind of miraculous because they're written on parchment, and parchment, falls apart, crumbles after a short while. But, and I used to think the reason why they survived uniquely there was because of the location. The Dead Sea is about the lowest spot on the face of the earth, and probably the driest also. All that helped, but my archaeologist friends tell me what really helped these manuscripts to be preserved, what was responsible for the preservation, is they were stuck into these caves out of the light of the sun. And the temperature and humidity inside the caves was remarkably constant. It's really the shifts in temperature and humidity that eat away at parchment. So it's really thanks to that that they survived. We don't really know where these manuscripts came from. The initial assumption of the people who explored the site was that there was some relationship between this building down below and these caves up above. And frankly, that was a good assumption in my opinion. I think that was right. The first thought was that the people who lived in the buildings down below were some kind of monastic sect, an Essene sect. They didn't just dream this up. There was a historian, Pliny the Elder, historian and geographer, who wrote in Greek, and he talks about having visited an Essene settlement on the shores of the Dead Sea south of Jericho. Well, that was this, and so it really seemed like he was talking about this settlement. It still really seems that way to me, I must say. So the first hypothesis was that this library belonged to the people who lived in the settlement, and then they must have stored these scrolls up in the caves because they were afraid of the Roman army that was advancing towards them. The only trouble with that hypothesis is that it's much too big a library for the number of people who could have lived in that building down there. Maybe there was room for 70 or 80 people, something like that. They also found a lot of pottery there, and so they figured, that corresponded to a monastery-like arrangement. But the number of texts is much greater than anything 70 or 80 people could need or use. And there are multiple copies of the same texts. So I think scholars have moved away from the first hypothesis that it was their library to a kind of compromise, which seems actually rather logical. This was if it was an Essene group, it was only one of several Essene groups that were present in the land of Israel. And as the Roman crushing of the Jewish revolt in the years 68 to 70 advanced, of the Common Era, advanced, these people were getting jittery, and they put all their valuable manuscripts in the cave, and they also invited their members who were elsewhere to bring their manuscripts as well. We know there was a big Essene quarter in Jerusalem, so it's certainly plausible that they might have galloped off to Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, stashed their manuscripts there, and then waited until the revolt was over and the danger from the Romans had disappeared, so that they could go back and reclaim their manuscripts. If that was what was happening, what was their thought, they really never got to go back and reclaim them, and that's why we have them today. I have to say, just out of fairness to the other side, there are some people who think that there's no relationship at all between this building down below and the caves up above. They don't even think that it was a residence. It might have been some kind of military outpost or factory or something, but they're wrong. Anyway, let me see. What did this library contain? What were in these scrolls? Well, to begin with, a lot of them were biblical manuscripts, and that was in accordance with the nature of the community. It was a religious community, so they had to have biblical books. They did, scholars have found fragments of every book in the Bible except for the book of Esther. And that may just be an accident. I mean, sometimes I find a little tiny quote, a brief piece of parchment that is from, let's say, the book of Ecclesiastes. And so they say, oh, well, Ecclesiastes was part of their library. It may be that they just never found that little scrap of the book of Esther, but that it was part of their library. Maybe they didn't like the book of Esther. There certainly were ideological reasons for them not to like it, so that its absence may be explained that way. But in addition to manuscripts of books from the Bible itself, there were manuscripts or little fragments of books from outside the Bible. We've known about these books all along. They were translated from Hebrew into Greek, and sometimes from Greek into other languages, Latin and Ge'ez, an Ethiopic language, and Old Church Slavonic and Coptic. The existence of these books was known, and we had their texts, but now little fragments, anyway, of some of these books were found among the scraps of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's the second category. There were biblical manuscripts and then some of these previously known books, not included in the Bible. And then in addition, they had the community's own writings, their prayers, their liturgies, the rules of conduct, and so forth. Every part of this library, I think, is interesting. What we can learn about the Bible from the biblical manuscripts is fascinating. What we can learn about the beginning of Jewish prayers from the prayers that they had is interesting. The rules of conduct are quite amusing. But for me, the most interesting thing of all is what many of these texts show about the state of biblical interpretation in the century before the beginning of the Common Era, the 2nd century or even the 3rd century before the Common Era. Why should that be the most interesting part? I mean, it might sound boring to you, but when you think about it, Judaism is a religion that is all about biblical interpretation. When you go to synagogue, your rabbi probably speaks about that week's biblical reading. You open up the Chumash, and there you'll find the text of the Bible, but also usually a commentary, like the commentary of Chief Rabbi Hirsch. Chief Rabbi Hertz that I grew up with, and then there are even there are later editions with their own commentaries. So that's certainly a good illustration of the role that biblical interpretation has informed Judaism. We say prayers, and you may not even be aware of it, but a lot of these prayers allude to passages from the Bible. They take on biblical phrases and so forth. This is the extent to which the biblical interpretation suffuses Judaism. You know, we're called the people of the book, but I like to say that we're really the people of the interpretation of the book. That's, you know, that's what really characterizes Judaism and gives it, as I hope to say today, its great strength. But where did all this biblical interpretation start? You might think it started in our own classical library, in books like the Mishnah or the Talmud or various midrashic collections. But that's really not the beginning, that's the middle, or one might even say, from my point of view, the end. The earliest ancient biblical commentary that one has is to be found in, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or those biblical apocrypha and pseudepigrapha that I alluded to. Genesis Rabbah is a rabbinic commentary. It's pretty late, end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century of the Common Era. The Babylonian Talmud is even later. But the Dead Sea Scrolls go way back, as I've said. Some of these books that were found there even preceded what we think was the time when the people living in that building first founded their community. Therefore, they go back to the 3rd century, maybe even the 4th century, before the Common Era. So they contain some of the earliest examples of biblical interpretation. Now, I have to say, interpretation among the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't usually written in the form of biblical commentaries. There are things like that, where they quote a verse and then say, this is what I think that verse means. But some of the most interesting things are little hints in all kinds of other texts, in prayers or songs, or those rule books I mentioned. So today, I wanted to show you some of this, you might almost call it accidental interpretation.